A wrong number usually ends with an awkward apology. For Lori T, it ended with a bloodbath. Trapped in a walk-in industrial freezer with the temperature dropping to sub-zero, hiding behind crates of frozen meat from a sadistic billionaire who swore to cool her temper, Lori tried to text her sister for help. Her fingers were too numb to feel the glass. She mistyped one digit. That message didn't go to her sister. It went to the private, encrypted line of Min Jun, the cold and calculating dragon of the Korean underworld, a number that had remained silent since the day his mother was buried.
The cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical weight pressing down on Lori's chest until every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Inside the industrial walk-in freezer, the world had shrunk to the size of a stainless steel tomb. Frost began to lace the edges of her white maid's collar, and the dampness of her uniform, soaked from the bucket of water Hyun-woo had dumped over her before bolting the door, was now turning into a shroud of ice. She huddled behind a stack of frozen crates, her body racking with violent shudders that she knew would soon stop. Once the shivering stopped, the end would be near. With fingers that felt like stiff wooden pegs, she fumbled for her phone. The screen's glow was blinding in the dark, revealing a terrifying 4% battery. Her vision blurred as she pulled up the message thread for her sister. "Help," she tried to type. "Hyun-woo locked me in the freezer. Basement, please." But her hands were shaking with such rhythmic violence that the letters danced away from her. A single mistyped digit in the area code went unnoticed as she hit send, the outgoing whoosh sound of the message feeling like her soul leaving her body. She dropped the phone into the frost, her head thumping back against the frozen wall. She closed her eyes, imagining the sun on her skin, trying to fight the encroaching lethargy. Then the phone vibrated against the floor. It wasn't her sister. The notification banner showed a string of numbers she didn't recognize. No name, no contact info, just a dark, void-like interface. Lori forced her eyes open, squinting through eyelashes heavy with crystalline ice. The reply was short, typed with a chilling, clinical precision that didn't match her sister's frantic energy. "Don't move," the message read. "Stop shivering. You are burning calories you don't have. Slow your breathing and save your oxygen. I am 5 minutes away." Lori stared at the words. A strange heat flickered in her gut. Not the warmth of safety, but the sharp electric sting of fear. She hadn't sent her location, yet whoever was on the other end spoke with the absolute authority of a man who already owned the ground she was dying on. Outside the heavy steel door, the mansion was silent. Hyun-woo was likely upstairs sipping a vintage Bordeaux, waiting for her to beg. He didn't know that his private fortress had just been breached by a digital ghost. Lori curled into a tighter ball, her breath hitching. She didn't know who was coming, but as the oxygen in the small space began to thin and the silence of the house was shattered by the distant, muffled sound of a front door being kicked off its hinges, she realized she had summoned something far more dangerous than a rescue party. She had summoned a reckoning.
The silence of the kitchen was shattered not by the turn of a key, but by the violent groan of structural failure. From her position on the freezer floor, Lori heard a sound like a localized earthquake. The heavy service door to the mansion being kicked inward with such force the frame splintered. Heavy, rhythmic footfalls thundered across the linoleum, a stark contrast to Hyun-woo's light, arrogant gait. There was no shouting, only the clinical, efficient clicks of safeties being disengaged. Then the industrial lock on the freezer door shrieked. The heavy steel handle jerked upward, and the door swung wide, letting in a flood of artificial yellow light that felt like a physical blow to Lori's dilated pupils. Min Jun stepped through the mist of escaping frost like a phantom born of shadow. He was a vision of terrifying order in a world of chaos, his black suit perfectly tailored, his silk tie undisturbed despite the forced entry. He didn't look like a rescuer, he looked like an omen. Behind him, 3 men in dark utilitarian gear fanned out, their eyes scanning the room with the hardened intensity of soldiers in a kill zone. Min Jun's gaze locked onto the small, shivering figure huddled behind the crates. His eyes drifted from the white headband, now tinged with gray frost, to the soaked, translucent fabric of her maid's uniform. For a fraction of a second, his composure fractured, a ripple of cold fury passing over his sharp features. "Lori T?" His voice was a low, melodic baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Lori tried to answer, but her jaw was locked in a frozen tremor. She could only manage a weak, shallow wheeze. Min Jun was at her side in a single fluid motion. He didn't hesitate, ignoring the ice and the filth as he draped his heavy wool overcoat around her shoulders. The heat radiating from his body was staggering, a violent reminder of the life she had almost lost. "Check the perimeter," Min Jun commanded his men without looking back. "If the owner of this house breathes, make it difficult for him." He slipped one arm beneath Lori's knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed no more than the frost on the walls. Her head fell against his shoulder, her numbed senses registering the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain. "You're late," she whispered, the words barely a ghost of a sound against his lapel. Min Jun looked down at her, his expression unreadable, but his grip tightening with possessive iron. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The man who put you here is dead. He just doesn't know it yet." As he carried her out of the kitchen and into the snowy night, the dragon didn't look back at the mansion. He only looked at the girl in the soaked uniform, the one who had accidentally summoned a king to her cage. The transition from the frozen dark to the dragon's den was a blur of searing heat and the rhythmic thump of a helicopter's blades. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was no longer blue and crystalline. It was a rich, oppressive gold. She was lying in a bed so soft it felt like a trap, draped in heavy silk sheets that radiated a steady, artificial warmth. For a moment, the silence was so absolute she feared the cold had finally taken her hearing. But then she heard the low, melodic hum of a heart monitor near her pillow. As her vision cleared, the luxury of the room came into focus, and with it, the danger. Standing at the foot of the bed were 3 men, their presence making the expansive suite feel suddenly cramped. They were the same rugged shadows from the kitchen, but now, under the warm amber glow of the chandeliers, their tactical precision of a private army. Their faces were hardened, their hands clasped in front of them in a stance of disciplined readiness. They didn't look at her for pity, they looked at her like a package that had been delivered to a lion's den. In the corner of the room, framed by a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering skyline of the city, sat Min Jun. He had shed his overcoat, but his fitted black suit remained immaculate, his tie still tied with a lethal sort of perfection. He was reading a file, the light of a tablet illuminating the sharp, authoritative angles of his face. Lori tried to sit up, her muscles protesting with a dull, aching heat. The movement caught his attention. Min Jun set the file aside and stood, his movements fluid and predatory. As he approached the bed, the 3 guards stepped back in perfect unison, a silent testament to the absolute power he wielded. "You're in the Moretti district," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "My personal estate. No one enters these gates without my seal. No one leaves without my word." Lori clutched the silk sheet to her chest, her worn, strained face reflecting in the polished mahogany of the headboard. Why save a maid?" she managed to whisper, her voice still raspy from the freezer's bite. Min Jun reached out, his gloved hand hovering just inches from her face before he pulled back, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Because you used a ghost's phone to summon a king, and because the man who put you here just declared war on the only thing I have left of my mother. In my world, Lori, that makes you the most valuable witness in the city and the most dangerous woman in this room." The warmth of the bed suddenly felt like a different kind of fever. She wasn't a victim anymore, she was a catalyst. Surrounding her were the sharp suits of the Korean Mafia, and at the center of it all was a man who looked like he was ready to burn the world down just to see who was left standing in the ashes.
The amber light of the room seemed to thicken as Min-jun walked toward a small, lacquered pedestal near the window. Atop it sat the device that had changed Lori's fate, a sleek, outdated burner phone that looked out of place against the modern opulence of the estate. He picked it up with a reverence that bordered on the religious, his thumb tracing the scarred plastic of the casing. "This phone was supposed to be a tomb," Min-jun said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly frequency. He didn't look at Lori. His gaze was fixed on the dark screen. "It belonged to my mother. She was the only person in the Moretti lineage who believed that mercy wasn't a defect of the soul. When she died, I kept the line active. I paid the bills every month, waiting for a signal that would never come. For 3 years, it was silent." He finally turned to face her, the shadow of the window frame bisecting his face, making him look like a statue carved from obsidian. And then, at 2 a.m., in the middle of a board meeting where I was deciding the fate of a rival shipping firm, it buzzed, a text from a ghost. "He locked me in. I can't breathe." I thought my mind had finally snapped. Lori felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezer. She looked at her own hands, still pale and trembling. She hadn't just reached out to a stranger. She had accidentally desecrated a shrine. "I didn't know," she whispered. I was dying. I didn't think anyone was on the other side." "My mother died because she was too kind to a man like Hyun-woo. She was soft where she should have been steel. When I saw your message, I didn't see a maid. I saw a debt that I failed to pay 3 years ago. I saw a chance to answer a plea that she never got to send." He stepped closer to the bed, the dragon looming over her. The rugged men at the door shifted their weight, their faces remaining impassive, but their loyalty to Min-jun was palpable. "You don't owe me for your life, Lori, but you are now the living proof of my mother's ghost. Hyun-woo didn't just try to kill a maid, he tried to snuff out the last spark of her legacy. That is a debt he cannot afford, and a war he cannot win. You are the guest of the Moretti family now. That means you are untouchable as long as you stay within my shadow." Lori looked into his dark, unwavering eyes and realized the price of her rescue. She wasn't just safe, she was drafted. She had been saved by a man who didn't believe in coincidences, only in blood, debt, and the terrifying weight of a mother's memory. Hyun-woo sat in the darkened ruins of his kitchen, the shattered frame of the service door serving as a jagged reminder of his humiliation. He swirled a glass of vintage Bordeaux, the deep red liquid catching the dim emergency lights, but his eyes were fixed on a small, blood-smeared piece of white fabric, Lori's headband. He had expected to find a corpse in that freezer, a silent lesson in obedience. Instead, he had found an empty tomb and the calling card of a monster. "Sir," a voice spoke from the shadows. It was his lead security consultant, a man whose face was a map of scars and cold indifference. "We've traced the security footage. It wasn't just a random break-in. Those were Moretti's men. The dragon himself carried her out." The wine glass shattered in Hyun-woo's grip. He didn't flinch as a shard sliced his palm, the blood mingling with the wine. Moretti. The name was a curse in the high society circles Hyun-woo traveled in. If Lori was with Min-jun, she wasn't just a runaway servant, she was a live grenade with the pin pulled. She had seen the ledgers, she had seen the offshore accounts he kept hidden even from his father. She knew about the special shipments arriving at the docks.
"She's a maid," Hyun-woo hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and sadistic rage. "She's a nobody from the South Side. Why would the most dangerous man in the city risk a war for her?" "It doesn't matter why," the consultant replied. "What matters is what she tells him. If that girl talks, your family's empire becomes a target for federal seizure by morning and Moretti's playground by night." Hyun-woo stood, stepping over the glass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone of his own, dialing a number that connected him to the city's most ruthless underground fixers. "I want her erased," he whispered into the receiver. "I don't care about the cost. 5 million for her head. Double it if she's silenced before she speaks to a lawyer." He looked out the window toward the skyline, where Min-jun's estate sat like a fortress on the hill. Lori thought the freezer was cold. She has no idea how much ice it takes to bury a secret. By the time the sun began to rise, the digital underworld was buzzing. The hunted maid had a price on her head that could buy a small country. The war was no longer just about a broken door or a mistyped text. It was a race to see who would break first, the girl who knew too much or the man who had the power to burn the city down to keep her quiet.
The recovery at the Moretti estate was not a period of rest, but a transformation forged in blood and soot. Min-jun did not believe in safety that wasn't earned, and he refused to let Lori remain a target. He took her to the sprawling basement of the compound, a place of cold concrete and shadows that smelled of gun oil and old stone. It was a stark contrast to the gilded cage upstairs, a reminder that the dragon's world was built on a foundation of iron. "Hyun-woo didn't just lock you in a freezer because he was angry," Min-jun said, his voice echoing against the damp walls. He stood behind her, his presence a wall of heat against her back. "He did it because he knew you were trapped by your own fear. In this world, the environment is never neutral. It is either your weapon or your tomb." He placed a heavy blackened blade in her hand. Her fingers, still pale from the frostbite, trembled as they closed around the hilt. Min-jun stepped closer, his chest grazing her shoulder, his hands reaching around to steady her grip. The intimacy was jarring, a sudden electric current that made the air between them feel thick and pressurized. For a woman who had spent years being touched only with malice, the supportive weight of his hands was a revelation. "Look around," he commanded, his breath ghosting against her ear. "The soot on these walls, the layout of the pipes, the way the light dies in the corners. You were a maid, Lori. You know the secrets of a house better than the people who own it. Use that. If they come for you, don't just run. Make the architecture scream." He spent hours moving with her through the shadows, teaching her how to turn a common cleaning agent into a blinding mist, and how to use the invisibility of a servant to become a phantom. As they worked, the professional distance between them began to erode. Every time he corrected her stance or guided her arm, the silence grew heavier, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the war outside. In a rare moment of stillness, Lori looked up at him, her face stained with grease and soot, her eyes no longer reflecting the hunted look of a victim. Min-jun's thumb brushed a smudge of carbon from her cheekbone, his gaze lingering on her lips for a fraction of a second too long. "You aren't a maid anymore," he whispered, his authoritative composure finally showing a hairline fracture of desire. "You are the soot in their lungs and the blood on their floor." Lori didn't pull away. She tightened her grip on the steel, realizing that while Hyun-woo had tried to freeze her heart, Min-jun was the one finally setting it on fire. The chemistry between the dragon and the survivor was no longer a secret. It was a spark in a room full of gasoline. The morning sun bled through the high windows of Min-jun's study, casting long, sharp shadows across a mahogany desk cluttered with more than just paperwork.
On its surface sat a manila envelope and a single handwritten check. The amount was staggering, enough for Lori to buy a small villa in the Caribbean, a new identity, and a lifetime of silence, far away from the bloodstains of Chicago and the freezing shadows of Hyun-woo's mansion. Min-jun stood by the window, his back to her, his authoritative silhouette framed by the city he controlled. The jet is fueled, his voice devoid of its usual melodic warmth, replaced by a clinical detachment. My men will escort you to a private terminal. You'll be in the tropics by sunset. Hyun-woo's reach is long, but my money is longer. You can disappear, Lori. You can be the girl who survived, instead of the woman who stayed for the war. Lori looked at the check. Her face, no longer strained and worn, held a new dangerous clarity. She thought of the freezer, the sound of the bolt sliding home, and the way Hyun-woo had looked at her like she was a stain on his floor. Then she looked at the soot still under her fingernails from the previous night's training. She stepped forward, her movement quiet and deliberate. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, her hands found the check. With a slow, rhythmic motion, she tore the paper in half, then again, until the fragments fluttered on the mahogany like oversized snowflakes. Min-jun turned, his dark eyes narrowing as a hairline fracture of surprise broke through his composure. "I spent my whole life disappearing," Lori said, her voice steady and low. "I made myself small so men like Hyun-woo wouldn't notice me. I wore the uniform and I stayed invisible, but the cold taught me something." She walked toward him, stopping until she was within the gravitational pull of his heat. "If I run, I'm still a victim. I'm just a victim with a view of the ocean." She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold steel of the handgun tucked into his waistband. She didn't pull away when he tensed. He didn't offer her a way out again. Instead, he reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a sleek, compact semi-automatic, placing it in her palm with the reverence of a king conferring a title. "The Caribbean is for the weak, but the fire is for us." Lori gripped the cold metal, the weight of it feeling more natural than the Maid's tray ever had. The choice was made. She wasn't running from the frost. She was becoming the flame.
The storm didn't begin with a bang, but with a flicker. In the master suite of the Moretti estate, the golden chandeliers hummed and then died, plunging the room into a velvet darkness. Lori felt the shift in the air before she heard it, the low-frequency vibration of the compound's perimeter being breached. She didn't panic. She reached into the darkness and found the grip of the semi-automatic Min-jun had given her. It felt warm, like an extension of her own hand. "They're here," Min-jun's voice came from the shadows, calm and authoritative. The red emergency lights bled into the hallway, casting him in a crimson glow. "The Russians and Hyun-woo's fixers have cut the main grid. They're coming through the service tunnels." "Let them," Lori replied, her voice steady. "They think they're entering a fortress. They don't realize they're walking into a refrigerator." As the muffled sounds of suppressed gunfire echoed from the lower levels, Lori took the lead. She didn't move like a soldier. She moved like the maid she had been, invisible, silent, and knowing every blind spot of the architecture. She led Min-jun and his rugged guards through the back galley, her soot-stained fingers tracing the walls she had learned to read like a map. Hyun-woo's men, dressed in high-tech tactical gear, swarmed the kitchen area, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They were looking for a victim. They found a ghost. Lori signaled Min-jun to hold. She reached for the central climate control panel, hidden behind a service panel. With a quick, practiced motion, she overrode the safety protocols for the estate's industrial cooling system. The vents hissed, and a blast of pressurized liquid nitrogen began to flood the narrow corridor where the invaders were bottlenecked. The temperature plummeted. The tactical gear of the mercenaries began to crackle with instant frost. Panic set in as their breath turned to thick clouds, obscuring their vision. Laurie stepped into the mist, her white maid's headband long gone, replaced by a gaze of frozen steel. She used the strobe light on her weapon to blind the lead assassin, the rhythmic flashes turning the hallway into a nightmare of disjointed motion. In the chaos, she was the only one who knew how to breathe. While the invaders fumbled with frozen triggers and numbing limbs, Laurie and Min Jun moved with lethal synchronization. She wasn't just surviving, she was hunting. She led the remnants of the hit squad toward the walk-in storage, the very place that was supposed to be her grave. With a final violent shove, the dragon forced the last of the mercenaries into the sub-zero chamber. Laurie slammed the heavy steel door shut, the metallic clang echoing through the kitchen like a death knell. She didn't hesitate. She slid the heavy bolt home. "It's a wet, muffled pop," Laurie repeated, the words that had haunted her dreams. "That's the sound of a heart freezing. Let them see if Hyun Woo comes to melt the ice." Min Jun stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his authoritative presence merging with her newfound fire. The estate was still under siege, but the tide had turned. The girl who had been locked in the dark was now the one holding the key. The smoke from the estate's tactical suppression system cleared, revealing a courtyard littered with the wreckage of Hyun Woo's hubris. At the center of the carnage stood Hyun Woo himself, his expensive silk suit torn and his face twisted into a mask of pathetic, desperate rage. He was trapped between the reinforced gates and the approaching shadow of the man he had tried to outmaneuver. Min Jun stepped forward, his authoritative presence radiating a cold, lethal calm. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't have to. The three rugged men of his inner circle stood behind him like statues of vengeance. But as Hyun Woo lunged forward, screaming about his family's influence and the disposable nature of a maid, it wasn't Min Jun who intercepted him. Laurie stepped into the light. She was no longer the woman in the soaked uniform with the strained, worn face. She stood tall in the tactical gear Min Jun had provided, her hair pulled back, her eyes reflecting the dawn with a clarity that made Hyun Woo stumble. "The only thing disposable here, Hyun Woo, is your legacy," Laurie said, her voice steady, devoid of the fear that had once defined her. She raised the semi-automatic, the muzzle leveled at the center of his chest. "You thought you could freeze me out of existence, but you only succeeded in burning away the part of me that was afraid of you." Hyun Woo looked at the dragon, pleading for a professional mercy, but Min Jun only folded his arms, a look of dark, awestruck pride on his face. "She's the one holding the leash now," Min Jun murmured. Laurie didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she stepped close enough to see the beads of sweat on Hyun Woo's forehead, then struck him across the jaw with the butt of the weapon, a physical punctuation to his downfall. "The police are coming for the ledgers I took from your safe, and the Moretti family is coming for everything else. You aren't worth the bullet." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Min Jun walked to her side. He didn't take the weapon from her. He simply placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the balcony that overlooked the sprawling, waking city. The sun broke over the skyline, turning the glass towers into pillars of gold. The hunted maid was gone, replaced by a woman who had survived the deepest freeze and emerged forged in fire. "The war isn't over," Min Jun said, his melodious baritone carrying a new weight of respect. "Hyun Woo was just the first domino. There are others who will come for what we have." Laurie looked out at the city, her fingers interlacing with Min Jun's, a grip of iron and shared intent. "Let them come," Laurie replied. "I know where they hide their keys. I know how their houses breathe, and I know exactly how to make them go cold." The wrong number had ended, The right partnership had just begun. Under the rising sun, the dragon and her survivor watched the world, ready to break everything that stood in their way.